Jesus performed many notable acts in public. He moved the masses with his words. He healed the sick. He even raised the dead. Yet no other exploit was as masked in mystery as his overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple. Why did this gesture hold such great importance? And what are we to learn from it? We will visit these questions on today's edition of Truth Unveiled. The narrative where Christ interfered the buying and selling at the temple has been related by all four Gospels, leaving a lasting impression upon Christians throughout the centuries. This incident, where Christ so dramatically interfered with the course of business, is often referred to as the cleansing of the temple. Today, I'd like to consider, why did Christ's high regard for the temple prompt him to behave in such a manner? When we look at our own day, we can see how we too can hold things in high regard by looking at an example of making a visit to a museum. Here we find artifacts, pottery, paintings, showcased for onlookers to admire. Pieces, many of which may be of great value, are displayed in a manner that highlights their unique features. The impression we are left with is that these showings deserve esteem beyond that of our common items. Whereby the atmosphere of a museum commands a degree of decorum, leaving one to recognize that this space is dedicated to special reflection. This was the approach that the Israelites were to have engaged in with God and his temple. The concept of something being special, and therefore treated as such, was to be associated with the house of God. The first temple was constructed by King Solomon in 832 BC. Throughout the subsequent generations, the Israelites time and time again failed to give God and his temple the reverence deserved. They proceeded to defile and desecrate the temple through their idol worship. As a consequence of their idolatry, in 422 BC, the temple was destroyed by the invading Babylonians. In 516 BC, a second but more modest temple was built by a remnant of the people that remained. This temple continued in operation throughout the time of Jesus. Around 20 BC, Herod the Great, who governed the area of Judea under the direction of Rome, embarked upon an expansion project to enhance the then standing temple. A massive plaza was constructed surrounding the sanctuary. This plaza was adorned with large pillars and columns reflecting the artistic influences of the day. These pillars formed rows of columns that supported a roof, allowing for worshipers a place to gather. Such porches outlined the entire plaza. The plaza was composed of a number of courtyards dedicated to hosting various visitors. The outer structure of the sanctuary itself was adorned with white marble, gold, and bronze. Herod's revitalization of the temple created an architecture of grandeur and beauty. The temple came to be known as one of the most impressive buildings in the then known world. Within these structures, temple functions were overseen by the high priest. In approximately AD 6, Annas was appointed high priest and served for 10 years. Following his service, the successive appointees to the role of high priest were all members of Annas' family, namely his sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas. Annas orchestrated control of religious and civil affairs through them. Annas was a very influential, powerful, and wealthy man. Even after his term, the people still recognized him as the unofficial high priest. Annas owned many businesses and was an unscrupulous business owner. One such business sold the livestock to the public meant for offerings at the temple. Sites were positioned at various locations in Judea, selling animals from Annas' own flock. The animals were sold at exorbitant prices, sometimes 4 times as much as fair market value. This adversely affected the poor's ability to purchase animals for offerings in their price range, such as doves. One of the locations in which the vendors of Annas operated was within one of the courtyards of the temple. By the time of Jesus, this courtyard had become the site of a commercial bazaar that Annas controlled. Space was rented out to various vendors at high rates, with a kickback to be returned to Annas. Under Annas, a bank also operated within the bazaar. The bank imposed high exchange rates for exchanging currency to the official coin of use. The bank also issued loans intentionally meant to adversely affect the poor, who in turn would wind up forfeiting their homes to Annas. Led by Annas, the family of Annas had become a corrupt enterprise. Even in the regulation of temple functions, the priests were subjected to paying kickbacks to the Annas family. Insubordination in this manner, in this regard, was met with physical assault. The stipends that the priests were to be paid for their service were removed from them by force. This corruption was well known in Jesus' day. And so it is with this understanding, with this background information, that we are able to have a better picture of Christ's motives and understand what he was relaying to the people in his expression and discuss with the goings and comings and dealings of things happening at the temple. We see this in Mark chapter 11, in verse 15. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all people'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And here we find Christ was in total disgust with the corruption that had invaded the temple functions. And many people were aware of the corruption that was taking place at the time and took offense to it. And Christ, being who he was, acted out and defended the honor and integrity of the temple of his Father. Now, many scholars will recognize that this action, this incident, took place more than once, and we see that detailed in the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke towards the end of his ministry, and we see that detailed in the book of John at the beginning of his ministry. And when we see in the book of John at the beginning of his ministry, where Christ arrived at the temple and drove the money changers out, this would have been in fulfillment of the prophecy and the details of Christ's arrival to the physical temple itself. Here we find in Malachi chapter 3 and in verse 1, "Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you desire, will come, says the Lord Almighty." And here we find in the book of John, at the beginning of Christ's ministry, Christ arrives at the temple. And this was an introduction to who he was and his role in serving the people and fulfilling the things that God the Father was looking for Christ to accomplish, particularly in delivering the message as the messenger of the covenant that Christ had to deliver. And that covenant being one where man could be re-engaged with God. And by the course of Christ living a sinless life, whereby his life would pay the penalty for the accrual of sin that all mankind had established on themselves, making it so that now that sin could be removed and not be attributed to mankind, and all mankind would be able to have an opportunity to re-engage with God. And so this is what Christ accomplished by arriving at the temple during this first incident and clearing out this disruption to the individuals that would have arrived at the temple to find a place of sanctity to pray and and find God and recognize God and meditate on His Word. But in fact, this was being disrupted by the 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 goings and comings of Annis's family and their thirst, unquenchable thirst for money and their inability to exact righteousness and how they did things and managed the temple functions. But we again see towards the end of Christ's ministry, where, as we just read, Christ once again returned to the temple. And this was also a display and a reminder to the people of what was about to happen. And we see such a thing in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 38, where Christ lets the people know that their inability to recognize who he was and accept him at his first coming would in turn result in them having the temple, this house, left desolate, and eventually it would be destroyed by the Romans. But there's still a second meaning, a further understanding that could be applied to the scripture of Malachi that we just read, where Christ, as the messenger of the covenant, would arrive to his temple. And we can see this further explained in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in verse 16. Here Paul explains, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." And here Paul brings to light that the temple is more than just a physical building, but now the temple is encapsulated as us. And we are individuals, we become vessels that hold the Spirit of God. And what we find is that Christ, the messenger of the covenant, arrives to the temple, but not the physical stone temple, but the temple of those he has called, of those that he is now allowing to make possible to have a relationship with God the Father. And we become those vessels, and we become that temple, holding God's Spirit within us, allowing that Spirit to transform our minds in the way that we think, in the way that we live, and have our character resemble the character of God as we seek out God and look to maintain a relationship with him and become more like him. And we see this further explained in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 1. Because we have these promises, dear friends, let us cleanse ourselves from everything that can defile our body or spirit, and let us work toward complete holiness because we fear God. And so we see, just as Christ arrived to the physical temple of stone and cleansed it from the acts and behaviors of the family of Annas, of the money changers and the vendors that were there, that were defiling the sanctity of the temple and the intent of the temple, allowing individuals to reconnect with God. We too need to be mindful of our mindset, our sanctity, as we hold the Spirit of God within us as his temple in our bodies. And we need to, as Paul said, look to cleanse ourselves so that nothing is defiling us as we seek to have a relationship with God. And I'd like to point out something further. When I speak of cleansing of ourselves, as we recognize that we are the temple of God, I mean to look towards making improvements to our behavior, improvements to our character, and enhancement of who we are as we look to become like God, as opposed to somehow sending us on a guilt trip, as if there's something inherently wrong with us, as opposed to simply recognizing our status as having been sinners, our status as standing in a place where we need correction, and we need to recognize our place and our sense of what we need from God, as opposed to just driving a guilt trip and constantly saying, there's something wrong with you and you need to change. You're never good enough. That is not what I am proposing or advocating, but instead looking to make corrections using God's Spirit to transform our mind. When we look at a student at the beginning of a school year, do we look at that student as despicable? Or do we look at that student as being prepared to learn the course of study throughout the year? And by the time they get to graduation, they've grown, they've changed, they've improved, they've enhanced their knowledge, and they too, and indeed have improved who they were compared to what they were at the beginning of the school year. This is what I am advocating by cleansing ourselves, by using God's Spirit to become more and more like Him, and coming to appreciate the opportunity to use God's Spirit and recognize the opportunity we have to re-engage with Him after Christ's sacrifice, and recognizing who we are as the temples of God.
Hi, we would like to offer some free online sermons that will help you examine today's topic. We would like you to listen to the sermon, The Second Temple, by George Roper. Also the sermon, The True Temple, by Robert Giove. You can find these sermons by visiting cgi.org and visiting the sermon section of the website and searching for the title of the message. If you live in New York City, New York, and would like to attend church with today's presenter, George Roper, visit cginewyork.org for more information. Thanks again for watching Truth Unveiled.